District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program. Welcome to District of Conservation. I'm your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. As we enter Thanksgiving, which is being held this Thursday, much to be grateful for the bountiful wildlife and natural scapes we have here. Also, we should be really grateful that we have reliable energy sources, even those that are vilified unfairly, such as oil, coal, gas, even nuclear, that keep the lights on and power this country, and even the derivatives of conventional energy sources, petroleum byproducts. They help fuel so much of life that we enjoy in this first world living environment that we have here in the United States. And this episode is going to center a little bit about that, but a new show that I like that's in this Taylor Sheridan Yellowstone universe. It's like Yellowstone, but for the oil and gas industry. Landman, starring Billy Bob Thornton. And as Yellowstone kind of gallops into the sunset, the series only has 3 episodes left. I'm partly sad, but partly excited for what is to come. It was such a great show. I don't really watch TV series, but I really was so drawn to Yellowstone because of the parallels to policy work in conservation, energy, trade-offs, things of that sort. And Landman has piqued my interest as someone who follows energy policy that we report here to you, especially as we enter a new era, or a return to an era, rather, where there was a focus on energy abundance, which is balanced very smartly with conservation that we saw under the Trump years. I believe, and I'm confident that we will see true conservation brought back, because whatever this last 4 years of conservation policy was, it was a complete bastardization of it. Let's be honest. If you've listened to the show, you have heard me talk at length about this deviation from mission at all these different agencies, DOI, EPA, Department of Energy, and the different associate agencies that fall under the purview of all 3 of those. There are a lot of real-world applications from Taylor Sheridan shows into real life and vice versa. And this Landman show comes at an interesting time while I'm talking about energy abundance and this return to a prioritization of reliable domestic energy, including nuclear, but nuclear really doesn't have much to do with Landman. But this focus of the Permian Basin, which is one of the most bountiful, plentiful places where oil and gas is extracted from. It's one of the leading hubs, epicenters of oil and gas reserves in the country. We have so many billions of cubic feet, trillions of cubic feet, even of both oil and gas reserves in this country. I don't want to bore you with the statistics, but it's in the billions, if not trillions, of cubic feet of reserves we're sitting on for both oil and gas. We have plenty of oil and gas to go around. So all this talk of it's going to dry out, it's going to go away, never really comes to fruition. But Landman's focus on the Permian Basin is very interesting because Texas is the top energy producer in the United States. But people are probably wondering, listening to the show, where does this come from? What was the inspiration behind Landman? Of course, with Taylor Sheridan coming from Texas, having an interest in kind of these confluences between industry, nature, environmentalism, development, that's what he's really communicated and conveyed through Yellowstone. You can find those kind of intricacies and confluence of those 2 different interests sometimes when they butt heads. You find that same dynamic in Landman if you're watching the show, and I don't want to give away any spoilers, but kind of the 30,000-foot view of it, I'm going to talk more so rather than giving you spoilers. But Landman was actually inspired by a very popular podcast from Texas Monthly. It's the Boomtown podcast. It was circulated between late 2019 through 2020. I just got my hands listening to it. I've even been encouraging people in Europe, I know, who follow American politics and energy politics, to listen to it and watch the series too, and even friends here in the States. But to get a sense of what the show is all about, the characters are more so fictionalized in Landman. They don't really parallel the characters or the interviewees that are in Boomtown. Boomtown, I think, is an 11-part series, short-term, limited podcast series. And I've been able to listen to about 9 of the 11 episodes as of this recording. The gist of Boomtown is this from Texas Monthly. In a rugged corner of West Texas, Billionaire wildcatters and roughnecks are fueling an oil boom so big it's reshaping our climate, our economy, and our geopolitics. This modern-day gold rush has sent both big oil companies and scrappy startups scrambling to secure a piece of the action. We're now about 4 years later, and like I mentioned, we're sitting on billions, if not trillions of cubic feet of proven oil and gas reserves. You look at the Energy Information Administration, you can find this information there. I'm not creating this out of thin air. So a lot of these, themes about boom and bust cycles in the podcast, I don't think the predictions necessarily came to fruition because we have had since 2020 Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which incidentally enough made people have to become reliant on oil and gas more because solar and wind were not doing it. Europe realized that they were too reliant on Russia for oil and gas and have been looking elsewhere. They were looking to the United States. They've also been flirting with unreliable solar and wind. A lot of the geopolitics has changed from this. We have also been producing, ironically, even under the Biden administration, it's not because of their policies, but because of supply and demand in the market. We've had historic pumping of oil and gas because of the different policies put into place under the Trump years that have really unleashed more oil and gas development, because you're seeing this charting towards net zero, which is a really flawed policy. You will never reach net zero emission. It's a fool's errand. Not only that, with this goal of reducing temperatures or lowering temperatures by 1.5 degrees Celsius, at best, if you destroy the economy under a so-called Green New Deal, you're only going to lower the temperature 0.2 degrees Celsius. It's minuscule, while having this untold destruction to the environment. So I've been critical of net zero, and that's where I stand even today, even going into a Trump administration. We're not going to see Trump advance a net zero agenda. But oil and gas has made a comeback because of geopolitics, about these different conflicts, and also people realizing that shifting very swiftly to unproven technologies that are less reliable than oil and gas even, and far less reliable, heck, even than nuclear energy. Nuclear is the most reliable energy source out there. And this is not a stab at oil and gas. I like oil and gas, but the true clean energy source that people should be touting, environmentalists should be touting, is nuclear. They're not, because they view that to be in competition with solar and wind, which are intermittent and don't work not even half the time of the year, not even 50%. At best, a capacity factor of solar and wind, solar only works about 24.9% of the year. Wind only works about 34% of the year. And both facilities require so much land. I'm actually going to get into a discussion from season 3, kind of this dialogue between Billy Bob Thornton's character and a lawyer about kind of the trade-offs to going fully solar and wind, and how even in the Permian Basin today, they're still very reliant on, and our life in the United States and around the world is still very heavily dependent on petroleum byproducts, even outside of the energy component. But since the Boomtown podcast has been published and circulating, and Texas Monthly and the podcast sponsor are actually co-producers of Boomtown, or Landman, which is from what Boomtown has spinned off into in this Hollywood iteration of Boomtown, but it's Landman, but largely inspired by this podcast. I highly recommend you listen to it. Not everything you're going to hear is pretty. It's gruesome, raw, a lot of ugly sides to the boom and bust cycle of the oil and gas industry. This happens in any industry. Let's be honest. It's not just oil and gas, but it has all facets covered. The economic productivity that comes with oil and gas, the jobs that are supplied, how the oil and gas industry prevents people from going into crime with high-paying jobs and keeping them busy. And then, of course, it talks about some downsides too, which I won't go into. I want you to listen to the podcast to get a sense of it. You can see this also paralleled in the show. Again, the names and the characters and the personages are very different between the podcast and the show. The show does touch upon some of the elements and the themes discussed in the podcast. You'll see, watching the first 2 episodes and even the 3rd episode, what this means. And it's probably the first attempt by Hollywood, because Taylor Sheridan seems to be not the black sheep in Hollywood, but he tends to be kind of like a realist in Hollywood who doesn't begrudge the regular American, doesn't begrudge hunters, anglers, oilmen, roughnecks, energy industry workers. He seems to be more respectful of hardworking Americans compared to his other compatriots in Hollywood, which is why I think this is probably the first attempt by Hollywood, in a sense, where they're painting a sympathetic light on the oil and gas industry, on oil and gas workers, even discussing some of the dangerous nature to this line of work. But it is a favorable portrayal compared to that one movie with Matt Damon where they were really lambasting fracking and saying that it's so corrupt and they're wanting to despoil the water. Although if you talk to frackers themselves, they'll tell you that's not what happens. But you've seen different portrayals in Hollywood of how bad oil and gas are. But this steers very differently from this Matt Damon film from 2012 that's called Promised Land, where it shows that these fracking industry professionals saw the light of the evil ways of frackers and decided to fight against it. So what I like about Sheridan is he shows the raw aspects, the good, the bad, the ugly, but the wonderful overall benefit that oil and gas supplies to us. Again, not only by the electricity and the fuel we consume, but also the byproducts. We really underappreciate the stuff, the byproducts of fossil fuels, so-called fossil fuels. And I think that's why American voters resoundingly rejected net zero, thinking, okay, this is not going to stop at oil and gas or coal or nuclear even. It's going to trickle down to the food I eat, the car I can drive, the EV mandates, the so-called tailpipe emission standards from the EPA, the Department of Energy banning household appliances that are powered by gas in favor of unreliable full electric appliances, which ironically consume more energy, use more water than conventional gas-powered products. So Americans recognize that energy is integral to life in all facets, not even just for the energy and electricity you consume, but also for the products we use and consume and rely upon. Hair dye, lipstick, makeup. Women have no idea what they're asking for fossil fuel phase-outs. You won't be able to have beauty products. You won't be able to curl your hair. Our cell phones have different components of rare earth elements and also petroleum byproducts. Light fixtures, desks, cars, all these type of different things we rely upon so much. So I want to talk about this exchange, episode 3 of Landman, which I have not seen yet, but I saw this clip circulate X or Twitter, and I figured I would talk about it. And this is the exchange between Billy Bob Thornton's character and a lawyer who's helping to address a very bad situation at one of the pump checks. But there's a scene in episode 3 where Billy Bob Thornton's character, Tommy Norris, takes this lawyer to a wind farm on one of the properties where they have leases on. And the exchange somewhat goes like this. And I'm going to link to the X clip, but from Texas Monthly, here's what the full exchange or most of the exchange looks like. He's talking about wind turbines. In its 20-year lifespan, the wind turbine, this is my insertion, so you understand what I'm talking about, won't offset the carbon footprint of making it. Unfortunately for your grandkids, we have a 120-year petroleum-based infrastructure, Thornton's character adds. And we're going to run out of it before we find its replacement. I dispute that. Again, I talked about that we have a lot of reserves, but of course you have to kind of add that as well. Another line that's pretty iconic from this exchange is, getting oil out of the ground is the most dangerous job in the world. We don't do it because we like it. We do it because we're out of options. There ain't nobody to blame but the demand that we keep pumping it. But you have to listen to the section about his railing of wind and solar and how, ironically, they can't function. The lubricants, the infrastructure, the base of these so-called clean energy structures cannot work even without oil and gas. Ironically, if you've seen a wind turbine up close, I've seen plenty up close. I was driving through Eastern Washington earlier this year when I was covering hydroelectric power stations for my Conservation Nation series with CFACT. I couldn't help but notice oil leaking from the blades of these turbines, right against the Washington-Oregon border as we were traveling from Portland, Vancouver, inland towards Eastern Washington. So they depend on fossil fuels too, and they don't work. And again, they don't offset carbon emissions. So you'll have to watch this exchange for yourself. And so what I take away from this show and what I will be taking away from it as I continue to watch it, I'm just excited that, like in Yellowstone, Taylor Sheridan really gives kind of the nuanced gray view of the different dimensions to oil and gas. And anyone who has friends or family who work in the oil and gas industry, I happen to know quite a handful of people now that I'm immersed in this more fully. I have friends in Pennsylvania oil and gas. I know people who've worked in Texas oil and gas, Louisiana, and other couple places. If oil and gas jobs were taken away from these rural, hard-hit, economically depressed regions, you would have more abject poverty. So these industries in areas that people don't appreciate here in this country, These industries give people a lifeline to sustain their lives, to get off of drugs. And drug use, of course, happens even when you're in the industry. But I'm saying if you're kept busy working in something as demanding and, potentially dangerous like oil and gas, you're not going to screw around. You're not going to be negligent. You want to have a good head on your shoulders. And most people who work in the oil and gas industry are not corrupt. You think of the workers, the roughnecks, the people who actually handle all the operations. They risk their lives. They put their lives on the line so people can have electricity. They can turn on the lights, turn off the lights. They can use different appliances. They can drive their car. They can do all these kind of activities. So we don't appreciate energy workers so much. And I'm so glad that this new show, Landman, can kind of bring us back down to reality about knowing where fuel and electricity comes from, that it doesn't just magically appear, that there's a lot of trade-offs to moving away from these reliant, dependent sources we've been consuming for the last century, give or take, as a civilization. What are the consequences of abandoning it? Are you truly going to be replacing it with a clean energy source? No. What are the true viable clean energy sources? Nuclear, geothermal. That's what people should be talking about to also complement what we have with fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas. I also think even aside from this show, earlier this year, we may actually see even coal leases on federal lands start to be reactivated because a Obama-era policy was revoked by a federal judge saying that the then President Obama couldn't revoke new leases on federal lands for coal production. Coal is still a very integral part of our electric grid. 16.2% of our electricity generation comes from coal. Couple that with natural gas, that's 60% of electricity generation from fossil fuels. Natural gas is about 44% of that. And then also nuclear is about 18.6% of that. So fossil fuels still power overwhelmingly our electric grid when you take everything into account. So we may even see that again. So interesting timing right after the election, of us pivoting back to normalcy, as what we'll call it, away from this net zero nonsense. Net zero is anathema to energy abundance. You cannot simultaneously say we're going to phase out fossil fuels and then we're going to have this abundance of energy here in the United States when you're dependent upon rare earth elements from China, when you're importing oil from the Middle East, when you're importing oil even from Venezuela, countries and continents that don't respect the environment as much as we do, where we're going to be taking more steps to get cheap fuel or electricity when we can do it here for a fraction of the cost with our environmental standards and whatnot. So I'm applauding this. I like that Hollywood is starting to appreciate these different, very important industries. So I encourage you to listen to the Boomtown podcast, watch the Landman series. Paramount Plus is not compensating me. I don't have anything to do with them. But if you're not wanting to pay for the service, this is just me, putting out information. They have free month-long subscriptions, so you don't have to pay for the subscription. But the subscription is not even like $10 for just a standard Paramount Plus subscription. It's like $7.99, and they have a promotion to get a week free and even a month free. I've even seen deals for 3 months free. So very easy to watch the program. I highly encourage it. And we'll continue to keep you abreast with what is happening with the show. But I really do enjoy it. Like I said, I'm not a serial TV watcher. I don't really like TV programs. But the Yellowstone, Taylor Sheridan universe, I really like. It's compelling storytelling, a little bit dramatic. But he gives life to these industries. And I also want to mention some wildcatters that I'm connected to on Twitter analyze the program. Chuck Yates is one of them. He has a Digital Wildcatters podcast. So I'm going to link to that as well so you can see what actual Landman and Wildcatters perceive the show to be like, if they like it. I think when I was watching their podcast and discussion, they didn't have so many reservations or qualms with the program. They actually liked a lot of the facets. So in the show notes, you can see a real world response and analysis from people who actually work in the industry from Chuck Yates. So you're going to find that in the show notes. I hope you check that out as well. Let me know your feedback. Have you watched Landman? Do you like the series? Do you like the Taylor Sheridan universe? Are you upset that Yellowstone is ending and we won't have these comparative shows to defer to? Or maybe I think there is going to be a sequel to Yellowstone. I keep hearing chatter of that. So we'll see. If Yellowstone is fully done, there still has to be a season 2 of 1923. We're promised by Taylor Sheridan. So as one chapter closes, perhaps another opens. Landman is a good program to fit the time for when these other derivatives of Taylor Sheridan come out, but I like it. I think you'll like it too. If you enjoyed this installment of District of Conservation, I would love to know your feedback. Send it my way. Please be sure to leave us reviews on Apple, Spotify, or wherever podcasts are played, and also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat nor a guest announcement. Thanks so much for listening to District of Conservation. I hope you have a wonderful day, and please share the podcast to those who may be interested in learning more about these critical natural resources, environment, energy issues.